I'm Leandra Letterman.
And I'm Allison Christians, and it's time to break into tax.
We don't think of grammar as sexy.
Well, I think it could be pretty sexy if someone puts together a really elegant phrase.
That's true. I do have a refrigerator magnet that says, "You had me at the correct spelling of your."
It's
That
so
is-
true, because there's nothing that stops you in your tracks faster than when the person didn't write the correct spelling of your. Then you see it right away.
Apostrophe catastrophe must be avoided. So to have your paper well written and not fall into some standard traps that make your paper harder to follow because of grammatical issues, there are a few things that you can do that will help you right away. So one of them is write shorter sentences. It's harder to go wrong with a sentence that's short and to the point. You're more likely to have misplaced modifiers or lack of subject and verb agreement or run-on sentences if your sentences are really long. Also, keep your paragraphs fairly short. Not just one sentence, at least 2 or 3 sentences, but try to avoid having them span a page or multiple pages. At that point, you've probably covered multiple topics.
Yeah, just keep it snappy. It's much easier to follow something that's short and active and gets to the point right away and has one point than to follow something that has multiple points pointing in a million directions.
That's right. And then in line with getting to the point right away, try to use active voice. So you can look through your paper and look for instances where the subject of the sentence isn't clear or isn't stated until the very end of the sentence.
Mistakes were made. Well, who made the mistakes? I always tell my students, if you can add "by zebras" at the end, then probably your sentence was passive.
And when you're looking through the paper holistically to look for errors, of course, pay attention to anything that your word processing software has flagged for you.
The ubiquitous squiggly red line, we're almost oblivious to it, right? It's almost like a pop-up ad. We just forget it. We don't even look at it anymore. But I see it right away. You turn in a paper that has a red squiggly line under it. That's the first thing my eye goes to. What's going on there?
Right. And you don't want your professor distracted by the grammar errors. You want your professor focused on the brilliant substantive arguments that you're making.
Exactly.
So some other ones that are common are writing like you speak. So there are some things that are acceptable in informal conversation that don't really work well in writing. Some of them are actual grammar errors, like when people say, "I could have done that" instead of "I could have." That's actually an error. And you might not notice when someone's speaking, "Oh, I could have gone." Other ones may not actually be errors, but they may just be too informal for writing.
Yeah, informality is one of these things that often you don't really think about it. You're just writing the way you think or the way you would speak to somebody, but that's not what writing is. It's communicating in a different way.
Right. And sometimes thinking about how you would speak it can be helpful. For example, it might help you to read your paper aloud or parts of your paper aloud to potentially spot sentences that are really long or other grammatical errors. And sometimes people can use that successfully to figure out comma placement, but that's not a perfect approach. One common comma mistake that I see is putting a comma in after the subject of the sentence when there's no modifying clause. So something like, "Professor Smith will be speaking to our class." You don't put a comma after Smith. Now, if there's a modifier, "Professor Smith, an invited guest, will be speaking to our class," then you need commas after Smith and after guest. But as the sentence gets longer, they might be more likely to think, "There's a whole bunch of words here before Professor Smith, I need a comma." And that's not the rule.
Right. Comma use is complicated. You can make a lot of mistakes. And also there are some things that not everybody agrees on. For example, the Oxford comma in a list. But I think that there's other people that have written extensively on this. And so if you're not sure, you really need to go find a link.
We'll give you some suggested links in the description. So check that out for some resources.
All right. What about the prepositional phrase that unnecessarily creates ambiguity in a sentence? I'm thinking about something like, the president said on Monday he will sign the tax bill. Was it on Monday that the president said he would sign the tax bill? Or was it that the president said he would sign the tax bill on Monday? There's so much ambiguity in a sentence like that.
That's right. And that kind of ambiguity can be a real problem if, for example, what you're drafting is a contract. Being careful about things like this is really important. I mean, I feel like that's the worst case scenario, but something that's maybe equally embarrassing is where it isn't ambiguity, but it actually suggests something completely different from what you intended. And that's an example sometimes where students use kind of a filler phrase at the beginning of the sentence, like looking at the Internal Revenue Code, Section 61 is not very long. And you could just say Section 61 is not very long. But the problem is when you add those sort of filler words, what you've actually said is Section 61 is looking at the Internal Revenue Code, which is not at all what you mean. What you mean is I'm looking at the Internal Revenue Code and I see that Section 61 is not very long. So that's another example. If you keep it short, you're much less likely to have some kind of misplaced modifier.
I think especially in law, clarification and knowing what words you said and if they mean the things you thought they meant is always, a problematic issue. Even if we use simple words, we don't always know what those words mean. We really don't want to complicate it with misplaced prepositional phrases.
Yeah, that reminds me of that famous line from The Princess Bride.
Inconceivable! You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
Something that may help with these issues of ambiguity or using a word that's different from what you really meant is after leaving it overnight, try rereading it from the perspective of imagining that you were someone who'd never seen this paper before and that you didn't really know what it was going to say. And try going through it and seeing where there's something that would confuse you if you were unfamiliar with the point that the author was trying to make, and see if that can help you spot ambiguities and mistakes.
This is hard, right? Reviewing your own work, especially if you spend a lot of time crafting it, editing, and weeding out some of the mistakes, you've actually spent a lot of time with your text, and now you might actually miss some really key or core discrepancies in the way you've put your sentences together. So time is so important. This is why you should not write a paper the night before it's due. You want to write it 2 nights before it's due so that you have 1 extra day to have another look at it. But I think having a look at it with fresh eyes, that's the key to finding a lot of those kind of mistakes.
A big one is which versus that. Very common error. So which is overused, basically. And a sort of shorthand that I use, and this isn't the technical rule, but that if you're using which, it should be something that calls for a comma after it. If it won't call for a comma, and this may not help everybody, it probably should be that. That's not the technical rule, which relates to restrictive clauses. And it's the example that is often used as something like the dog, which has 4 legs, is a mammal. You're talking generally about dogs. If you're talking about a specific dog, you wouldn't say the dog which has a bell around her neck is named Daisy. It should be the dog that has a bell around her neck is named Daisy. You're identifying a specific dog, and the that is actually an indicator that you're doing that.
These are the sorts of things up with which I will not put. I mean, really, it's...
Thank you, Yoda.
I see which used a lot when that will do, and I sometimes think it's an affectation. So I caution that there's a tone aspect to the decision to use which instead of that. Sometimes you're trying to sound a little bit more sophisticated. The contract which had this or that clause. Well, most of the time it's that.
I think that's an example of hyper correction. For example, you're taught in certain instances, you're supposed to say, and I, instead of and me.
Mm-hmm.
So John and I went to the store, not John and me went to the store. But then people sometimes hypercorrect and they use it when it actually is supposed to be me. So John gave the bread to me, not John gave the bread to I.
Yes, you're much more fancy if John gave the bread to I.
It sounds wrong, like
Yeah.
you're trying to be fancy, but you don't quite know the rules. Another example, one that's much more common, is people have started using myself incorrectly.
Yeah.
Like John and myself went to the store, which is fine, but it won't really fly in formal writing.
You really have to pay attention to these small details. It's like getting the finish right. It's a way to polish everything and make sure everything reads correctly.
That's right. Another example that might fall into hypercorrection is sometimes I see nouns capitalized for no apparent reason, and proper nouns are of course capitalized. So names are capitalized. And in law, we often capitalize defined terms. So in your paper or in a contract, you might define who is the plaintiff. And then once you've defined that Smith is the plaintiff, you've defined that as a term with a capital P and you use plaintiff as a capital P, and that makes sense. And you can define a whole lot of terms like that. You could define Internal Revenue Code as the code with a capital C, for example. But where you haven't defined a term, sometimes I see students use a capital letter, I think because they have something maybe specific in their own mind, or because they think it gives it some kind of emphasis.
Language has usages and context, and sometimes things that we think were always one way might change. And I think they is in that category. It used to be always they would be a plural when referring to humans. And now I think we are coming to a point where we accept they as a singular form.
In this vein, I think to be careful of is institutions and corporations are not a they. The Treasury Department issued regulations. They said, that's fine if it's the regulations, but if it's the Treasury, you can't be using they, you have to say it. And you see how you create ambiguity if you say they, because then I'm thinking, oh, you're referring to the plural in the previous sentence, you're referring to the regulations. It's very common that students refer to an institution as a they, and I would eliminate that use. I think that's still incorrect. And institutions and corporations are not a he, they're an it.
And a country is an it.
And even if it's comprised of a group of people, like the IRS has a lot of people working there, but you don't say the IRS, they did something in a formal context. You say it did something.
That's not all we have to say about legal writing, but we just want to do a little bit. So we'll come back to you next time with a little bit more as we break into tax.
See you next time.